My wife Lynn and I have been together for 6 years and married for 11 months. Our entire history together has been very normal, and never once have I noticed any weird behaviors or red flags. I can't stress enough how out of character this whole thing is for her. Lynn is very kind, intelligent, and thoughtful. She's always been the no-nonsense type of person. Being childish or trying to scare me is not something she'd normally do. She doesn't even like watching horror movies. When we first started dating, she agreed to watch The Shining with me because she knew how much I loved horror. She was so scared that she didn't even make it through half of the movie before we had to turn it off. She isn't into anything creepy and has never been into pranks. It's just not something she likes, and that's fine. But that's what's so strange about all this. It's just so unlike her. I should also add that she has never had any mental health issues, and as far as I'm aware, it doesn't run in her family. I know some people are able to hide their mental health problems, but in the 6 years and 11 months we've been together, I think I'd have seen some kind of sign. Let me tell you where this all started. 2 months ago, I was in the kitchen making myself some coffee before work. I was running a bit late, and I knew I wouldn't be able to make it to my usual coffee shop to get my fix. As I was taking a sip of my coffee and hurrying down the hall towards the front door, I happened to notice Lynn peeking at me from around the corner of the wall ahead of me. I could only see her eyes and a strand of her long dark hair hanging up against the wall. She had concealed the rest of her body behind the corner. When I noticed, I nearly spilled my coffee when I saw her, and I did in fact burn the shit out of my lips. "Jeez, Lynn," I said, wiping a few drops of coffee from my pants. "You scared the shit out of me." She immediately popped out of view like a little kid that had been caught at hide and seek. I heard her scurry off towards the living room, and by the time I got to the front door, she was completely out of sight. That moment was really weird. It was totally out of character for her like that. But I also found it kind of funny that she was being more playful than usual and acting a little less serious. As I left, I shouted that I loved her and called her a weirdo. As I shut the door behind me, I could hear her laughing. At that time, I found her behavior to be a little bit odd, but it certainly wasn't something to freak out over or become suspicious of. I forgot about it by lunch, and by the time I got home, she was her normal self again. I didn't bring it up, and neither did she, and our lives went on. But the next incident happened 3 days later. It was around, I think, 2 in the morning, and I had woken up in the middle of the night. As one does when this sometimes happens, you feel pretty thirsty, and so I decided to get up and get a drink. I was standing in the kitchen with a glass of water in hand, and I felt a strong feeling like I was being watched. Now, when I was younger, my family and I would keep pets. Dogs, cats, that sort of thing. Now, when I was younger, my family and I had a few pets. Dogs and cats, that sort of thing. For most of my living life, I had had a pet in the house. And they would often walk around, checking out what we were doing. And sometimes I'd be standing with my back turned, and they would enter the room, and they would be looking at me, and I could tell that they were looking at me. Lynn had wanted us to get a pet. She wanted a dog, and I really, really did not want to get one, because after living most of my life with at least one pet in the house and having to go through several pet burials and the heartache that comes with that, I had had enough of pets for a while, and Lynn was sympathetic and acquiesced, so we didn't get a dog. However, at that moment, I really wish we had gotten that dog, because it would explain why I felt like I was being watched in my own home, despite the fact that it should have just been myself and my wife should have been in bed. So at that moment, I slowly turned around, and in the darkness of the night, I could see something pale and illuminated towards the kitchen floor. I looked down at it, and my eyes focused, and I saw my wife's smiling face staring back up at me. She was peeking at me from the other side of the kitchen island, staring up at me with wide, unblinking eyes and grinning at me like a Cheshire cat. I screamed. I'll admit it, I screamed. Not out of irritation or anger, but I screamed out of fear, because for some reason at that moment I was afraid. At the sound of my scream, Lynn scuttled backwards out of my view, her hands and feet smacking the tile floor as she hurried out of the kitchen on all fours, not even bothering to stand up. I didn't move after her, or even call out after her. I just stood there, frozen in shock, wondering what the fuck had possessed her to do that. It took me a little longer than I'd like to admit to go back upstairs, but I eventually did. When I got to our bedroom, Lynn was lying on her side, asleep. Or at least she was pretending to be. I stood at the edge of the bed, standing over her. For a little while, I watched her breathing, and I counted the seconds of her breaths to see if she really was asleep. I had the feeling she might jump out at me the moment I lay down into bed. I slowly climbed into bed and lay down, and thankfully she didn't. In fact, she didn't even respond at all. Her breathing was soft and deep, and I was starting to wonder if I dreamt the whole thing. Except I still had the glass in my hand. The next morning, I waited for her to come down for coffee, and after handing her a mug and kissing her cheek, I decided to ask her about it. "What was that about last night?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light so I didn't offend or embarrass her. She frowned over her cup of coffee, shaking her head like she had no clue what I was referring to. I tried to refresh her memory. "You were peeking at me, again. From over there?" I said, pointing to the spot on the floor by the kitchen island. She followed my gaze, and when she looked back at me, she burst out laughing. She laughed so hard that I couldn't help but join her. "You creep me the fuck out sometimes. You know that?" I said. She giggled and set her cup on the counter, sauntered over towards me, and wrapped her arms around my neck, hanging off of me. She stroked my cheek gently and brushed some hair off of my forehead and said, "You creep me out all the time. So I guess we're even," she teased. We said our goodbyes and left for work. As I drove, I kept thinking about how creepy it had been, seeing her grinning at me from behind the island like that in the middle of the night, and the sounds her hands and feet made on the floor as she crawled away. I told myself she was just trying to be silly, just trying to join me in my love of all things horror. I mean, it's not like I was afraid of her, but it didn't sit right with me. I began to see her peeking at me more and more. Sometimes she'd be peeking out from behind the couch or the living room curtains. She even once managed to get inside her grandmother's old trunk that sits at the foot of our bed. I might not have even known she was there at all had the trunk's old hinges not given her away. She'd had the lid propped open just enough so that only half of her face peeked through. She'd been grinning at me like an excited toddler. It was just unnerving. I didn't even know what to say to her. All I could do was stare. And when I finally found my voice, I asked why on earth she was doing this. She didn't answer, but she had slowly closed the lid, shutting herself inside the trunk. I just walked away, feeling disturbed. I didn't understand why she was doing it, but clearly she was enjoying it and it made her happy. I just hoped she would tire of the game quickly. Fortunately, Lynn didn't peek at me for the next 2 weeks, and I was starting to think she was done with her weird prank, and I was very relieved. One night we were watching a show on TV, and I jokingly said that I hadn't seen her peeking at me lately, and that she must have given up on her spying game. She looked up at me with a small smile and said, "Maybe I've just gotten better at it." I didn't say anything, and I was wondering whether or not she was joking. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about that. Was she still peeking at me when I wasn't looking, and I just hadn't noticed? And if so, what the hell was she getting out of all of this? I was beginning to feel paranoid, constantly checking whether she was watching from around the corner, or behind a door, or inside her trunk, or underneath the bed, or in a closet. I was jumpy whenever I was home, and she wasn't in full view of me. I felt stupid and a little crazy. But after a few weeks without another incident, I began to relax. I stopped checking behind furniture and walls and closets and underneath beds, and told myself that she had finally stopped. But a few days ago, things got so much worse. Lynn had left to go to a friend's place, and I lounged on the couch and played a couple of games on the TV. Around 9 o'clock, I had a shower, and as I was washing the soap out of my hair with my eyes closed, I had that same awful feeling that I was being watched. I washed all the soap out of my hair as quickly as I could, and I opened my eyes, and I think I almost had a heart attack because Lynn was peeking at me from behind the shower curtain, her entire head stretched into the shower, leaving just her body outside. Her long, dark hair wetly clung to the curtain, the ends dripping with water. Her mouth hung open in a terrible grin, eyes wide and red, like she hadn't blinked in a while, and the steam and hot water had been burning her eyeballs. I screamed, and I jumped back against the wall. She didn't react. She didn't move, and her smile didn't waver. Her makeup was running down her cheeks in 2 black streaks. She looked giddy and completely deranged. I was absolutely terrified. The two of us stood like that for a few moments, neither of us saying a word. Finally, after what felt like forever, she slowly pulled her head back out of the shower, and I watched her blurry silhouette through the shower curtain as she moved backwards towards the bathroom door. She disappeared properly from view, and a second later, the bathroom door slammed shut, hard enough to rattle the mirror. I screamed again and jumped out of the shower and rushed as quickly as I could to lock the door. I stayed inside that bathroom for about an hour. Maybe I overreacted to some of you, but whether or not this was a joke, I wasn't going to put up with this crazy shit anymore. At least that's what I kept telling myself as I paced in my bathroom, stopping to listen at the door every few minutes. Suddenly, I heard a muffled sound, and I pressed my ear against the bathroom door, straining to listen. I couldn't hear anything, but I envisioned Lynn standing on the other side of the door, giggling at her joke. At that thought, I felt a surge of anger. I was beyond pissed. I'd been made to feel scared in my own home and made to hide in the bathroom for an hour. All for what, exactly? Some kind of joke? Well, if it was a joke, it was a pretty bad one.
What the fuck, Lynn?
I snapped.
This shit is getting really fucking annoying!
I waited for her to laugh at me, or apologize, or call me a jerk, or acknowledge what I had said in any way. But instead, I heard a faint moan. So quiet, I wondered if I'd heard it at all. And then complete silence. "Lynn?" I called out, not even able to hide the fear in my voice. I got no response. Just the sound of my own heavy breathing.
Just fucking stop it!
I yelled, pounding my fist on the door. I waited for her to yell at me, something I would expect from her, hearing me talk to her like that. I had never screamed at her before. But there was nothing, just the occasional drip from the shower head. At this point, I was pretty scared. I was too afraid to open the fucking door and face my own wife. I waited another 30 minutes or so, which, when you're scared, feels like a lifetime. And finally, I decided that I wasn't going to spend the night hiding in the bathroom. So I got down on my hands and knees and peered under the door. I was almost expecting to see her face peeking back at me, but thankfully, I didn't. I could see straight down the hallway to the top of the stairs, and no sign of Lynn. I wasn't sure if I should be happy about that or not. I watched for a few minutes, waiting to see her head pop up over the top step, but it never came. I wasn't sure if I should be happy about that or not. I watched for a few minutes, waiting to see her head pop up over the top step, but it never came. I began to feel a bit more confident. I stood up and reached out towards the doorknob, my hand hovering there and mentally preparing myself to open it. Slowly, I began to turn the lock, and I was about to yank it open when I heard a sound that still makes me feel nauseous when I think about it. A moan, louder than before. But this time I was able to tell just where it was coming from. I turned my head towards the closet door as if in slow motion and locked my eyes with my wife, who was peeking out at me from the gap. Her eyes were still wide as ever, and her mouth was hanging open in the most grotesque, gaping smile I'd ever seen. I couldn't scream. I was too scared. Her hands were clasped to her chest, whole body trembling with sheer delight, as if she could barely contain her excitement. A short, raspy moan bubbled up from her throat, deep and raw, sending a shiver through my entire body. I suddenly gained the ability to pull the bathroom door open, and I ran as fast as I could all the way down the steps, quickly grabbing my keys and phone from the table in the living room before running outside to my car. I could hear her shrill laughter behind me, but I didn't hear it getting closer, and I didn't bother shutting the front door. I ran all the way to my car, down the front porch and the steps, and I drove away from the house faster than I legally probably should have, shivering the entire time, either from fear or from the cold, maybe a little of both. I hadn't grabbed a coat or even a pair of shoes. I was still in my underwear, and my hair and skin was still damp. I drove straight to my brother Chris's house, about 40 minutes away, ignoring any and every text and call that I got. I didn't check my phone until I was safely parked in my brother's driveway. Lynn had called me 4 times and sent a flurry of texts, all wondering where I'd gone and why I'd left like that. I threw my phone at the dashboard in a rage, furious at her nonchalant attitude. My brother and his wife were surprised to see me, especially in my underwear, but they said I could stay as long as I needed. Chris lent me some clothes and asked me what happened. I told him Lynn and I had had a fight, and I didn't go into the details. I didn't want him to think I was overreacting, leaving my wife over a prank, even if it was a strange one. I mean, hadn't I encouraged her for years to lighten up instead of being so serious all the time? I had wanted her to relax and loosen up, but this was definitely not what I'd had in mind. I tried to sleep on their sofa, but I just couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Lynn's face staring at me from inside the closet. Just knowing that she'd been in there with me the entire time made my skin crawl. She'd never even left the bathroom. Instead, she slipped inside the closet and slammed the bathroom door shut to fool me. And she had fooled me. The mere thought of going back gave me anxiety. I tossed and turned, completely unable to sleep. Chris ended up giving me a sleeping pill, so I was able to get a little rest. My sleep was filled with nightmares, all of Lynn's, terrible, smiling face. I woke up just as the sun began to rise. My body ached from the sofa. I felt sore and drained. I knew I'd have to call Lynn at some point, but I just didn't know what to say to her. And I wouldn't be going home unless she gave me her word she'd never do any more creepy shit. I just wanted my wife back. Her normal, serious self never looked so good to me. I was contemplating calling her and telling her that when that same horrible, familiar feeling came over me, like I was being watched. I was lying on my back, staring up at the ceiling, and my heart was in my throat. I didn't want to look away, but the longer I ignored the feeling, the worse it got. My eyes drifted away from the ceiling, almost on their own, towards the living room window. And that's when I saw her. Her face was pressed up against the window beside the couch, and she was staring down at me with that same gaping smile. Drool was dribbling down her lips, leaving 2 long streaks down the glass. I didn't know how long she'd been there, but something told me she'd been there quite a while. Possibly all night. I didn't bother screaming. Though I was afraid, my anger was greater. At that moment, I was furious. I jumped up from the couch and rushed to the window, and I stood face to face with her and I yelled,
Lynn? Are you crazy? What the hell is wrong with you? Just go home!
I shouted.
Now!
She didn't move, and her ghastly expression never changed. If anything, her smile only grew wider, as if she'd had never been more elated. I could hear Chris and his wife moving around upstairs. As if Lynn could hear them too from her place outside, her head twitched slightly in their direction, and she began to close her mouth slowly and draw away from the window. Chris called my name from upstairs, obviously concerned. I turned to see him and his wife Rebecca hurrying down the steps. When I turned back to the window, Lynn was gone. The only sign she'd been there at all were the 2 streaks of drool still dripping down the glass. I tried explaining to Chris and Rebecca about waking up to see Lynn watching me through their window. They were skeptical. I mean, who wouldn't be? Chris and I went outside to the spot in front of the window, but there were no footprints in the dirt, just a slight indent. Animal, probably, Chris guessed, and I chose not to argue with him. He and Rebecca assumed I dreamt the entire episode, but they didn't understand, and I was too tired to explain it to them. I called out of work that day and turned my cell off. I didn't want to face Lynn. Just talking to her was too much for me at that point. I really started to believe something was irreversibly wrong with her. That no matter what promises she'd make, we'd never be the same again. The thought saddened me to my core. I cried most of the morning. I was crying because this was, in all likelihood, the death of our marriage. And I was mourning the life we had built together and how it was gone. By noon, I figured I was ready to confront her, give her one last chance to explain herself. I could at least give her that after the 6 years we'd been together, I told myself. I turned my phone on and saw the dozens of texts she'd sent, all coming from a seemingly concerned wife. For example, here's some of the things she'd sent me. Can we talk? I love you. Please call me. I'm really worried. Can you answer? Just come home. And more of the same. All texts telling me she loved me and she wanted me home. How worried she was. And not a single one actually addressing the crazy stuff she'd been doing. Like she hadn't been acting like a character from a Stephen King book. Even her texts were different. She normally texted me whole novels just to tell me to pick up a loaf of bread. You'd think she'd have more to say after acting this way, after driving me out of the house. But no, I know it probably seems childish to some of you who are away from the situation, but if you had seen the way Lynn had looked at me, how she scampered away on all fours like a wild animal, how she had been grinning at me from inside the closet like a lunatic, then I think you would react similar to me. I ended up staying with Chris and Rebecca for another night. I didn't wake up yesterday until afternoon, and thankfully I didn't see Lynn's face watching me through the window. I don't want to pry because it's not my place, but is this fight something that can be mended? Rebecca asked. She made us both a sandwich for lunch, and I knew she wanted to breach the subject without seeming to be nosy. I don't know. She's like a different person, I said, choosing my words carefully. I still wasn't ready for her or Chris to know the full extent of the craziness I had been dealing with. People change, Ben, but she's still the same woman you married. Maybe you both just need to talk through your issues. Whatever's going on, I'm sure it can be fixed, she said, ever the peacemaker. I think it's beyond that now. I don't think talking would help. I just don't trust her, I said. The words stung in my heart. I missed and loved my wife. Or at least, I loved who she was. But how can I live with someone like that? Living in constant fear didn't sound too appealing. Lynn loves you. She has to be absolutely crushed, Rebecca said. I don't know about that. Well, she certainly seems like it to me. I've never seen her so upset. Very much unlike the Lynn I know, Rebecca said, shaking her head sadly. It took about 30 seconds for me to really understand the full implication of her words, and when I did, I could feel dread worming its way through my skin. Wait, what do you mean? You saw Lynn? You spoke to her. You saw Lynn, I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. Rebecca nodded casually, as if that fact wasn't nightmare fuel. Because I guess for her it wasn't. She stopped by this morning just after Chris left for work, she said, cleaning the plates from the table. I didn't see her car, though. Maybe she took an Uber or something. Beck, what did she say? Did she come inside? I asked, sweat starting to break on my forehead, my heart pounding in my chest. I began looking around, examining corners as though a predator lurked behind them. No. She just asked if you were awake yet, and I told her you weren't. I asked if she wanted me to wake you, but she said no. She said just to let you sleep, she said as she washed the dishes. That's all? She didn't say anything else, I asked. No. She looked awful, though, like she hadn't slept in days. I really think you should call her. I got up from the table and thanked Rebecca for lunch. I felt a little bit better at the knowledge that at least she hadn't come inside. Or, I suppose at least Rebecca thinks that she didn't come inside. Still, I needed to double-check that the doors were locked. I sat for a while, trying to figure out what to do next. I didn't want to go home, but I felt that I owed it to Lynn to help her if I could. When we got married, hadn't I sworn her an oath to love and honor her through sickness and in health? Clearly, she was very sick. If she was sick, which I truly believed she was, I had to try and get her the help she needed. But I didn't even know where to start. I didn't want to call the police. And besides, even if I did, what the hell was I going to tell them? That my wife had been peeking at me? That she was being creepy? As bizarre as she'd been, she hadn't actually committed any crimes. Not yet, anyway. The police would probably have said that I was overreacting, and to call them when she actually did commit a crime, which is really helpful if the crime is killing me, or something worse. And this wasn't just some prank. This felt wrong, dangerous even, like there was something sinister lurking beneath her smile. I knew that as her husband, technically, legally, it was within my rights to have her committed to a psychiatric care facility, but I really didn't want to do that. Firstly, because I wanted to give Lynn the chance to get better on her own. And secondly, what if she simply started acting like normal in the presence of the doctors? She'd obviously been able to fool Rebecca into thinking she was normal. And as long as the doctors didn't find her to be a danger to herself or others, they'd have no choice but to release her after 72 hours. At this point, I just felt totally lost and overwhelmed. So I did what any husband in my position would do. I called her mother. I didn't want to, believe me. Her mother, Marianne, and I were never on the best of terms. We'd never fought or anything like that. She just wasn't a very warm person and wasn't really easy to get along with. She hardly ever smiled, and when she did, only her lips would move into a thin-lipped smile, leaving her eyes just as blank as before. She gave off this aura that felt like she was permanently on the offensive. I'd only met her twice, and both times were for really short visits. I got the impression she didn't approve of me for her daughter. Lynn always ushered us out quickly, as she didn't want me to feel uncomfortable, which I was grateful for. Being in her mother's company felt almost unbearable, like walking on glass eggshells. I was glad when we moved 3 states away, so we didn't have to see her often. I was happy to avoid the woman, but I needed her help. I really didn't want to talk to her at all, but I had to talk to someone, and someone who knew Lynn better than I did. So I did what I had to do. Yes, she answered, already sounding irritated. Marianne, it's Ben. Do you have a minute to talk? I asked. I could hear her cluck her tongue in irritation. I'm in the middle of writing some checks, but if you insist, I suppose I can spare a moment. What is it that you want to discuss, Benjamin? She said coldly. It's about Lynn. She's been acting strangely, and I was wondering if you had any idea whether there was something. I was quickly interrupted. It's a bit difficult to follow your rambling, Benjamin. What is it that you want from me? She asked. I could almost see her, standing there in her thin sweater and slacks, tapping her fingernails impatiently on a table. I wanted to know if you'd ever noticed any odd behavior, or possibly any mental health issues, I asked. There was a long, uncomfortable pause, and I couldn't tell if it was because she was just thinking or something else. Finally, after a few seconds, she spoke. I'm not sure if this is one of your jokes, Benjamin, but if so, I don't find the humor in it. Now, I do have business to attend to, so if you don't mind, she said, but I cut her off before she could get rid of me. Marianne, it's not a joke. I'm sincerely concerned about Lynn's mental health. Her behavior has been very erratic lately. I'm very worried about her, and I figured, as her mother, you would be as well, I said, my frustration evident in my voice. If you're truly concerned, then I suggest you get the health professionals involved. I don't know what you expect of me, she snapped. I could tell she was seconds away from hanging up, and I was desperate not to let her. I had the feeling she knew a lot more than she was letting on. Please, if not for me, do it for Lynn, I tried. I heard a faint, shaky intake of breath, as if she were trying to hold her steely persona together, but failing. Marianne, I started. Benjamin, I don't know what to tell you. My only advice would be to seek professional help. Do not call here again. Goodbye. I tried to call out to her, but she'd already hung up. And I knew better than to call back. I tried to wrap my head around the call and her refusal to help me. Even if she didn't like me, why wouldn't she want to help her own daughter? I couldn't understand that. I tried to replay the conversation, desperate to find something I missed. After a while, I almost gave up, until I remembered her last words. Seek professional help. She said those words with a bit of emphasis. I could have just been grasping at straws, but no, I was sure her voice had changed ever so slightly when she'd said that, as if they were very important words. What exactly had she meant? I assumed she'd been referring to medical professionals, but maybe she was referring to someone else, someone that she didn't, for some reason, feel comfortable saying directly. Or maybe I was just desperate. I waited for Chris to get home, and after a very long and exhausting conversation with him and Rebecca, I successfully convinced them that Lynn truly needed psychiatric help. I didn't tell them everything. I wasn't prepared to go into it all just yet, but I did tell them about our last encounter, how she'd hidden in the bathroom, peeking at me from the closet. They were obviously shocked, but thankfully they believed me. They too just wanted to help her. Still, they didn't think it was all that serious. Weird, unusual, maybe even unhealthy, but not dangerous. They just kept saying that Lynn had to be playing some kind of weird joke. Chris didn't think we should involve the police just yet. He offered instead to go with me, and I readily accepted. He reasoned that calmly talking to her, trying to coax her into going willingly, was the best recourse. I agreed to do it his way. At least I wouldn't be going into that house alone. We drove over this morning just after breakfast. There was no way I was going at night. When we pulled into the snowy driveway, my stomach began to do somersaults. Her car wasn't there, but I still didn't let my guard down. The front door was ajar, and for a second I thought we'd see her eyes staring through the gap. I was shaking and starting to sweat. Chris, however, was fine. He waited for me to open the door, his hands in his pockets, like he was just taking a stroll through the park. I envied his ignorance. I pushed the door open, and I was immediately hit with a stench of rot. Chris smelled it too, and he walked in the house behind me with his nose scrunched up. "What is that? That's fucking disgusting," Chris mumbled. "I don't know," I said. "Didn't smell like this when I left." The house was silent and dark, despite it being 10 in the morning. All the curtains were closed up tight, refusing to allow any sunlight inside. If I hadn't been living in this building and left just 2 days prior, I would have thought the house was abandoned. We moved through the house, room by room, carefully checking any place that she might hide, occasionally calling out her name. "Why the fuck are you looking under the couch?" Chris asked eventually. "Are we looking for your wife?" He was looking at me like I was crazy. "Let's just go upstairs," I whispered. He shook his head but followed me up the stairs to check the bathroom and spare bedroom. On the way up, my shoes crunched on something, and I looked down at the steps and saw pieces of broken glass. I looked to my right, and I noticed that one of Lynn and my wedding photos that usually hung up on the wall along the staircase had been smashed. The frame hung crookedly. All of the glass was removed. I stared at the picture, a lump of sadness forming in my throat. We had taken that photo just after leaving the church, just after saying our vows. She looked so beautiful in her white gown. I looked at Lynn's beautiful face. I could never have imagined that her face would ever be a source of terror for me. We climbed to the last of the steps and checked the spare bedroom, but it looked completely untouched. I was hesitant to go into the bathroom. I was too intensely reminded of that night. Chris noticed and offered to go in by himself, but I couldn't let him do that. So we walked in together, checking the closet and the shower. The bathroom looked as if it hadn't been touched since the night I left. "I don't think she's here, Ben. Why don't you pack some clothes and we'll try coming back tomorrow or something," Chris said. I nodded in agreement and went into our bedroom and shoved some clothes from some drawers into a duffel bag. The smell was getting worse. I needed some coats, so I went over to the closet, and as I opened up the closet door, I came across the source of the smell, and I had to gag. I stumbled out of the room, dry retching, and I told Chris I had found the source of the smell. Chris went over to the closet, took one look inside it, and all the colour drained out of his face. He had to exit the room, and he stood next to me by the stairs to get away from the sight and the smell. After regaining my composure, I went back inside, and I stared down in shock at what lay inside my bedroom closet. Soaking blood into the floorboards were at least a dozen eyeballs, all carefully laid out in their pairs. Some were as big as a large coin, while others were as small as stones. I stared down at the eyes, and they stared back at me. It seemed she had collected them from small animals, and I wondered how she'd gotten them. And I shuddered at the thought. Man, I thought I had it bad with Rebecca's shoe addiction, but fuck me. Your wife's collecting eyeballs, Chris said, gagging. Ben, I think we should go, he called from the hallway. I'm getting sick. All right. I grabbed my duffel bag, and I shut the closet door carefully on my new nightmare. I stepped out into the hall and took a deep breath of fresh air. Well, relatively fresh. I could still taste the rot on my tongue, and I couldn't help but gag again. Who the fuck lines up eyeballs in their closet like that? Chris mumbled. A sick person, that's who. I told you she needed help, I said. She doesn't need help, Ben. She needs a fucking exorcist, he said. Are you coming or what? I can't stand the smell any... His words died in his throat, and his eyes grew wide with fear. I didn't bother asking him why. I could feel it. Someone was watching me, and I'm pretty sure I knew who. I turned around, slowly, tracing where Chris's eyes were looking, slowly scanning the bedroom. Oh, fuck, I whispered as I finally saw what we'd both missed. Underneath the bed, curled on her side, watching us with the kind of excitement of a kid on Christmas morning, was my wife. She held her hands together, tucked just under her chin, and they were shaking eagerly. Now that she knew she'd been found, I could hear the quiet noises she was making. A sort of hiccuping sound in her throat, as if the excitement was just too much for her. It was unnerving, to say the least. Wide eyes, and that same huge smile. Everything inside me told me to run, but I forced it away. This was my wife. No matter how twisted, she was still the woman I married. I had to at least try to help her. Lynn? I said softly. She didn't reply, but she kind of responded. Her head bobbed back and forth in two quick little movements, as if she were nodding. Baby, I just want to help. Okay? Can you let me do that? I asked. I had taken a single step forward, carefully approaching her like some kind of dangerous animal. I love you, Lynn, I said softly, taking another step closer. She let a tiny moan escape her wide-open mouth, and I had to resist the urge to run. Her shoulders were starting to shake, and her eyes grew wider still, as large as plates. I crouched down so I could see her better, and immediately I could see the blood. Her hands were covered in blood. They trembled more the closer I got, as if getting closer made her barely able to contain her excitement. Lynn, are you hurt? I think you're bleeding, I said. She bobbed her head again, her bloody fingers moving up and down as if playing an invisible piano in front of her. They occasionally grazed her chin, leaving smears of blood on her skin. I wanted to recoil in disgust. The smell that was coming off of her was revolting. I could feel the vomit trying to climb up my throat. Her lips were dry and stretched thin, blood seeping between the cracks. I knew she wouldn't come out on her own, but I didn't want to leave her in the state she was in. I scooted a little closer and reached out to her. The excited, hiccuping sounds got louder, and her hands shook, fingers flexing. It was then that I could see the blood oozing from in between her fingers. "Lynn, you're bleeding," I said. Instinctively, I reached out to take her hand, but before I could even touch her, her hand sprang out towards me. A sharp, fiery pain shot through my arm, and I fell back on my ass. My arm burned, and I could see blood dripping down onto the carpet. I looked back at her in shock and saw her grinning madly, her fingers clutching a large shard of glass. "You all right in there?" Chris asked from behind me. I turned my head slightly and nodded to him, cradling my arm to my chest. When I turned back to face Lynn, I saw that her focus had shifted. She wasn't looking at me anymore, and she wasn't smiling anymore either. She was staring past me, her eyes glaring at Chris the way a hungry lion might stare at prey. Her mouth was hanging open, but it was twisted into a snarl. I got to my feet and began walking backwards down the hall, afraid to take my eyes off her. "Are you bleeding?" Chris asked. The moment the words left his mouth, Lynn started fast scooting out from underneath the bed, the glass shard still in her fist.
Chris, run! Go!
I yelled. He must have been too afraid to move, because a second later I felt my back bump into him. He was still standing at the top of the stairs, staring at the horror that was my wife. Lynn had crawled out completely from underneath the bed and now stood in the bedroom doorway. Her face twisted up in rage. Her whole body was visibly tense. Blood ran down her fingers and onto the floor. "Jeez, Lynn," Chris said. "You, playing hide and seek?" I reached back and pushed him towards the steps. "Move your ass, Chris," I said as quietly but firmly as I could. Lynn bobbed her head in fast, jerky, sharp motions and began to grin, stretching her mouth open wider and wider so that her chin seemed to descend all the way down to her chest. I heard Chris mutter a prayer, and then he was running down the stairs. I stood at the top of the steps, stuck between the love for a woman who clearly needed serious help and my own sense of self-preservation. "I only want to help," I said, choking back tears. Her eyes focused on me once again as she slowly lifted the glass, holding it out in front of her. And then she started sprinting towards me, grinning with utter excitement. At this point, involuntary flight took over my body, and I flew down the stairs, skipping 2 or 3 at a time. I made it to the front door before I felt her leaping onto my back, wrapping her arms around my neck, her open mouth next to my ear so that I could hear those terrible hiccuping sounds so close. I shook her off, knocking her to the floor, and I felt a searing pain in my back as she went down, but I tore open the front door and bolted to the car. Chris was standing in the front yard, talking on the phone with the police. I didn't say a word. I just ran to my car and leapt in. Chris took the hint and followed me, still on the line with the cops. I watched in the rearview mirror, sure I'd see her there, running after us as we drove off. But I never did. We went straight to the hospital. I ended up with 11 stitches on my arm and 6 on my back. The police asked us a lot of questions and went back to the house to do a search, but Lynn wasn't there. They advised me to stay with a friend or a relative I knew for a while and to file a restraining order as soon as I could. But none of those things would matter. Somehow I just knew. I dropped Chris off at home and went to a motel an hour away. I wanted to put as much distance between me and Lynn as I could. This is where I've been for the last 4 hours. I thought maybe the police would find her. Maybe they'd get her the help she desperately needs. But now I don't think so. Because 40 minutes ago, I got a text from an unknown number. Just 3 words. I found you. And a photo was attached to the message. The photo was dark and grainy, but I instantly knew who it was. There was no mistaking my wife's eye. I started typing this out immediately afterwards. I don't know what to do. I'm alone, and I'm scared, and I can't help but feel like I'm being watched.